Like everyone in the world. I assumed Miles Braun was a complicated genius. But why? Look into the clear center of this glass onion. Miles Braun is an idiot.
Oh.
So it's 2025 and Shadiversity has made yet another video about how his channel is dying and how it's all YouTube's fault. In some sense, I've become accustomed to the regularity of these videos. The seasons change, Shad whines, and the world continues to turn. Yet somehow, I always find something new to talk about with regards to Shad. In this case, I think the clip from the glass onion is a lot more applicable than you know, because Shad has unknowingly given me something to ponder. A puzzle, a conundrum whose solution is actually much simpler than I ever thought it would be. But first, as always, let's give Shad his due.
Sword content on YouTube, especially the way it has existed for my entire time making content for over 10 years, very much seems dead, especially with the recent changes that have been happening on YouTube. There might be a couple of different ways in which it will still be around, but it is now plain to see that the type of content as it has existed in the past will never be the means to be able to sustain a large channel in the future or support a business. As someone who genuinely loves this content, I've consumed and made it, yes, for over 10 years now, this does genuinely suck. I do have a plan to try and keep it around, but it has to be in a sustainable way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that with you later in the video with an important question to you, my viewers, and the people who love this content. But the content needs to change, or at the very least, the way it is framed if it wants to have any measure of reach in the algorithm. I've already done some experimentation, and it still might not work. But the fundamental problem that is at play here, which is affecting multiple channels, not just myself, this is kind of across the board in regards to long-form sword content specifically, content that is solely and only about the sword itself, history, usage especially, barely gets any attention or promotion in the algorithm these days. This has been blatantly stark with the videos I've made over the last 2 months and from videos that I have been watching come out on other channels. I've been noticing this trend for over a year now. I literally made a video a year ago pointing out the things that I had noticed that now many people, many, and I mean many how-to-do YouTube channels are saying the same type of things that I was saying a year ago in terms of this is what the algorithm seems to be prioritizing more.
Thanks, Shad. I think you've laid out the problem quite nicely. And the thing is, I don't think you're necessarily wrong. Scalagram, someone whom Shad acknowledges is not as politically toxic as himself, also made a video about how sword content is being increasingly less viewed, and thus increasingly less profitable. I have a much better opinion of Scalagram than I do Shadiversity, and thus, when Scalagram talks, I'm more inclined to actually listen to him. Sword content is not as popular as it once was, and in my opinion, Shad has not really managed to recognize that he has not changed for the better. Like Shad said, he's been making YouTube videos for a decade. It's a long time, and although it doesn't feel like it, a decade is a massive time on the internet. We just do not appreciate how time flies on the internet and how fast internet culture and the landscape around it changes. But this is not the time to retread old ground. If you want to watch an explanation for why Shad's content is dying, you can watch my previous video about him. The question that I'm interested in is whether or not it was actually sustainable to be a sword YouTuber in the first place. Why? Because this is a question that underlies the heart of Shad's whining. He's used to the idea that if he just made the right sword videos, he wouldn't have to work a real job. I want to interrogate how true that actually is. I know it seems like a strange question. After all, Shad has been making sword content for a decade now, to the point that he was actually seemingly able to generate enough money to waste on building a castle for his kids, and to pay numerous yes-men like jesters for his king's court. But I'm not actually convinced that it ever was sustainable. That is, that you could ever actually be a real full-time sword YouTuber. So to start my investigation, I think it's worth looking at some of the legacy YouTubers that Shad is talking about. These were people who rode that initial wave of YouTube success by making mostly historical, mostly weapon-related content. To just about compile a list, we have people like Skalagram, Lindy Page, Metatron, Schola Gladiatoria, Shadiversity, of course, and Modern History TV. By compiling this list, I think we have already found our first issue. These 6 YouTubers are, especially in the Sword community, massive in terms of the number of subscribers that they have. They count as legacy YouTubers because they were around back then, but also because they still exist today. However, these 6 are far from the only Sword YouTubers that were around back then. Does anybody remember Thane Trand? I do. London Longsword Academy, run by Dave Rawlings, who is literally one of the founding members of the HEMA movement, has only 26,000 subscribers, and his channel is 15 years old. This man's got a whole range of swords that have been used by thousands of HEMA fighters that bear his name, and yet he has never actually managed to translate that into what we call YouTube success. Arguably, if you got rid of David Rawlings, the entire Sword community, nay, the entire HEMA community, probably would be very different, and yet that level of real-world significance never actually translated to YouTube significance, or of course, broader online reach. There are a lot of other YouTubers who might have made that cut, and you can, of course, drop your own list in the comments below. We are kind of suffering, I think, from a selectivity bias when we try to look at who actually made it in the YouTube Sword community. A lot of people were making YouTube videos, but they never actually became YouTubers, right? And those that still managed to become YouTubers now are facing down the prospect of being a shadow of their former size. Also, an astute viewer at home might realize that there's something specific about these YouTubers that I have chosen. There are some trends that I think segregate Shad from the others in the Big Six. Firstly, Shad's the only one who is really running a channel as a sort of collaborative team effort / business. While he started as a solo video maker, like pretty much all of them and pretty much all of YouTube, he's the only one who actually decided to run his channel like a business with employees and staff. Skalagram, Lindy Page, Metatron, and Matt Easton all are the primary presenters and basically workers on their channel. They do not have large teams of staff, at least relatively speaking, that can do the work for the channel, and still they operate as individuals with much lower overheads than Shad's actual business. Jason Kingsley is of course in a different situation, but I'll get to him later. My point is that if you actually look at who made it, Shad's the anomaly in terms of how his YouTube channel evolved into something like a business, as opposed to the others who primarily retained their solo YouTuber personas and their operations. I don't think that's for no reason either. While I'm sure that personal preference plays a role in this, some people certainly don't want to outsource work to others, I think actually it's just probably economic reasons for why most of these guys have stayed largely solo YouTubers. It's just simply less overhead to run a channel with one person doing most of the work. Yes, a business that has editors, scriptwriters, prop makers, etc. will be able to produce more videos. I mean, just look at what happened to the Tasty video channel. But the reality of the matter is, such a channel is also much more unstable and vulnerable to market changes in the YouTube business model. If your overheads are less, you can survive on leaner times. Shad, I think, just assumed that the good times would last forever, and now he's paying the price for it. Of course, there are big YouTubers that have staff. Mr. Beast can get a huge number of people to work for him because his channel has 400 million subscribers. And he hoovers up a huge amount of money that's flowing in the YouTube ecosystem. But even then, Mr. Beast doesn't operate with the footprint of a Hollywood studio. He's operating at the scale of a small to medium business. We can talk about whether a channel like his should exist another time, but, something tells me that Shad wouldn't be in favor of the government coming in to impose business regulations on YouTube. My own personal opinion, which you're free to disagree with, is that I don't think that Shad would actually mind if he was the only sword game in YouTube down. I think the whining that we hear from Shad is just really Shad falling and screaming from his pillar, whose foundations, as I believe, were always made out of sand. But yes, we should probably circle back to Jason Kingsley, who is the operator of the channel Modern History TV. At first glance, it seems like Jason is just another one of the large Swordtubers in the YouTube ecosystem. But Jason Kingsley is not an ordinary man. He's actually a very successful businessman, one of the co-founders of Rebellion Developments, which is a game studio. And he's an officer of the Order of the British Empire. He's one of the few sword YouTubers that we could actually talk about who is probably an actual knight, or at least the closest modern equivalent to it. So while Jason is a businessman, a successful one by most available metrics, I would hardly call what he does on YouTube a business. It's clear to me that he produces his YouTube videos because he finds the subject interesting, and he has a vested interest in producing edutainment content for his audience. In reality, I think he's actually the successful version of the kind of person that Shad wants to be. Somebody who is acclaimed for actual skill at arms, well regarded as an expert if not an authority, and somebody who is independently wealthy regardless of how YouTube goes. The thing is, of the YouTubers in that big list that I've mentioned, Matt Easton is the only one who seems the most unperturbed by the changes to YouTube. His channel is one of the smaller ones, sure. He doesn't have 1 million subscribers, but he also doesn't tend to complain about YouTube like Shad does. Yes, he's made some changes to his content. You can just look at how his thumbnails look now as opposed to in the past, but foundationally, I don't think that Matt Easton has really changed the core of his content. If you want to get some kind of antique sword looked at, Matt Easton's got a video for you. If you want to hear about discussions about how to actually sword fight, Matt Easton's got some thoughts. Do you want to see a movie fight review? Matt Easton's probably there. So why can he do this? Well, because YouTube is not his full-time job. It is a secondary income stream that stands apart to Matt's main job, which is more involved in the world of antique stealing and the like. Pretty much all YouTubers, at least in my experience, start making YouTube videos without actually being able to monetize their efforts online. It's not as if the minute you upload a YouTube video, YouTube's like, here's a check for your ad revenue. That's not how it works. The vast majority of YouTube channels will never actually see a single cent from YouTube, even if their videos generate content that people can watch ads on. So for most of the people making YouTube videos, myself included, we have to have other jobs. We have to because YouTube simply won't pay our bills otherwise. I'm not upset about this. I've always ever thought of this channel as bonus money. I make videos because I feel like I have something to say, not because I wanted to make money. But when I think beyond just the big sword YouTubers, I think that most of the other actual sword YouTubers also have to have jobs. YouTube never paid enough for them to actually be full-time YouTubers in the first place. In fact, the vast majority of the people making sword content on YouTube were probably never approaching anything being professionals. They were almost always either unpaid amateurs, doing it for the love of the game, or they were doing YouTube as a side hustle without the expectations that it would provide primarily for their needs. So again, I think that Shad is an anomaly. He is a fraction within a fraction, one of the rare YouTubers in a niche hobby who managed to get enough attention on himself that he could, for a time, pretend to be a small media company instead of a guy in a room talking to himself on camera. To ask the question then, was it ever sustainable to be a sword YouTuber? I think the answer is yes, but with a lot of caveats. Yes, you could be sustainable if you operated as a solo or near solo operation with minimal expenses. If I compare Scalagram to Shad, they're both channels of a comparable size, but Scalagram does almost all of the work of the channel on himself. He's the primary presenter, and he has been for years. He also does all the research and all the script writing, at least for the most part. He has also, to my knowledge, no children to support. So, in a lot of senses, he's operating a very lean situation here. He has to pay for his rent, sure, and his food, and maybe some sword stuff, but for the most part, he can run a tight ship. By contrast, Shad's previous operational norm is to have a staff of people, and also he has a bunch of children to feed. If I had to wager on whose channel would ultimately be sustainable in the longer term, I think I'd wager on Skal, not Shad. I think I'd also wager that of the two people, Scalagram is more actually likely to adapt to the changing YouTube landscape than Shad is. Yes, I know that Scalagram makes videos about how YouTube is changing, but he genuinely tries to interrogate why it's changing and what he can do about it. He doesn't just throw his hands up in the air and immediately start grifting to the right. If we look at the rising stars of the YouTuber sword community, it's people like Robin Swords and Desquitem. These are people who do not do YouTube as full-time jobs. They are passionate amateur YouTubers who are able to amass a large enough following online to get them some money, but not actually without crossing that barrier to being their full-time jobs. Nor do I think they would want to. YouTube full-time will place many more constraints on the types of content that they could do, and that's because it would be their entire source of income. I think it's different when you're just posting a video because you want to, and because you think other people might find it interesting. It's another if you're thinking, oh, if I don't get this video to become viral, I won't be able to make my rent this month. That's just how it works when your hobby becomes your job. Do I think that YouTubers should earn more money? Yes, absolutely. But I don't think that changes the underlying economic reality. Actually, speaking of Robin Swords, he made a video recently about how a fencing master was also a cobbler, and talking about how actually, back in those days, when historically sword fighting was the norm for society, a lot of fencing masters still had to have full-time jobs. They would fence on the side, they would teach on the side. And making a full-time living from fencing instruction was extremely rare, which is mind-boggling when you think about it, because swords were, of course, the norm back in those days. What we see now, I think, with sword YouTubers and whatever, is that that's just a modern-day incarnation of that. It really sucks that Shad has to wake up to a reality that many of us have been living with. Sometimes you just have to accept that you need to be a cobbler if you actually want to fight with swords in your free time. I have been a HEMA instructor for many years now, and people always ask me why I don't do it full time. Well, for starters, convincing enough people to pay me a living wage in a third world country to teach them swords is already a difficult enough ask. I think it's a challenge to get people to even afford the equipment that we need for HEMA at prices that my students can afford. Let alone thinking about what it would cost if I had to tack on to all of those costs, the costs required to provide me with anything beyond a poverty wage. No, I provide instruction out of a desire to grow the community and to share with people. I really just want to share with people the joys of historical fencing. I give my time, such that I can spare, freely, and I do not make any expectation of a reward. And I am, of course, privileged in that sense. I work a job that can cover my expenses without having to charge these people money. Lots of other fencing coaches are not so fortunate. Sometimes life just sucks that way. It's my belief that the YouTube sword scene was artificially inflated since 10 years ago on YouTube. There was a demand for sword content and relatively few sword creators, and thus a bubble was born. The platform wasn't as big as it is now, and there just wasn't as much stuff to take up people's time. A few creators found their way to make some money, and even fewer found a way to make a lot more. The actual size of the community interest, the actual real number of people that could be cultivated in this community to watch sword content religiously, well, I don't think that number was ever really that massive to begin with. And the thing is, whatever that number is, it is increasingly being divided by many, many more things these days. Sometimes people ask me about HEMA, and I tell them truthfully that it is one of my life's great passions. That without HEMA, my life would be duller and more miserable, and I would regret so many things in my life. I actually dread the day when I won't be able to do HEMA anymore. I find it as an existential horror for myself. And yet, for a lot of people, they couldn't care a single iota about swords at all. Not even a single iota. For some people, they just don't care about swords at all. I really do think that Shad is overestimating the potential size of the audience on YouTube that is interested in sword content. The last thing that I want to talk about is actually the changing nature of the YouTube audience. One thing that becomes apparent when Shad talks about his audience is that he seems to act like his YouTube audience is some sort of eternal, unchanging mass. Shad started really his channel in 2015. If you were 10 years old watching YouTube then, you're 20 now. If you were 30, you're 40 now. What Shad doesn't seem to appreciate is that I think that his audience might have actually started to age out and up from his content. When you're a kid or a teenager, you have endless amounts of time to spend on stuff like sword content. When you're an adult with bills to pay or a family to raise, you have much less time. Tastes really do change over time. I think one of the things that demonstrates how successful Robin Swords is that he managed to grow his huge audience of people using TikTok, an app that is used a lot by the current generation of young people. And that success on TikTok was how he managed to leverage himself to get big on YouTube. Shad seems to think that the youth of today will be galvanized to his content in the same way as the youth were maybe 10 years ago, but that's just not the case. If you want to grow your audience, then you actually need to learn how to appeal to an entirely new generation of people who are also divorced from the same cultural framework that you yourself grew up with. The kids of today do not watch the same movies or play the same video games that I did. If I wanted to appeal to them, which I really don't, then I'd have to reach out to them in terms that they'd understand, which I don't think that Shad is really capable of doing. He's a conservative. He's constantly obsessed with this idealized version of the past that, never actually existed in reality, but Shad isn't self-aware enough to realize that. The other thing about the audience aging up is that tastes of the audience age up as well. When you're young and you're starting out, you don't know anything about swords. Some guy just swinging around a wooden sword, well, that's enough for you, right? But as you get older, maybe you actually can go to a HEMA club. Maybe you can actually learn how it is to sword fight for real. I think, the problem is that Shad is just not a professional in any real sense of the word, right? His only real qualification, I would argue, is being a YouTuber. It's very obvious if you've seen his terrible short film. He doesn't know how to sword fight, and he doesn't know how to make a movie. The problem is that younger people are impressed by surface level stuff. Just look at the audience for Mr. Beast. If you've got an audience of youngish people or younger people, They're much less likely to know about a topic, and thus they're going to be a lot more impressed by surface level or pedestrian knowledge. I really don't think that Shad built his audience up of 50-year-old HEMA veterans at the time that he was starting his channel. I think he might be in denial about that fact, but I think that's true. Shad's primary audience were amateurs, people who didn't know anything, or people who wanted to learn but didn't quite trust themselves to learn on their own or to source alternative learning. There's nothing wrong with having a channel that caters primarily to surface level content. There are lots of channels that are successful by just providing beginner level introductions to people. The problem is, there's a lot of competition for this kind of knowledge now. Compare a channel like Desquadem. This is a high-level, fully armored fighting channel that showcases a wide proficiency of sword fighting and does it in armor. Any fight video on that channel blows Shad's short film out of the water in both the level of quality of sword fighting and also the level of production that goes into it. This is a guy who knows how to film a fight. Yet, this creator is not a full-time YouTuber. He gets money from Patreon to finance his films. But in the end, he's doing this for the love of armored combat, and the fact that he shoots small-scale armored duels is how he's able to afford it. He doesn't try to shoot beyond his means by trying to film, say, a massive battle. If your audience gets into HEMA, they're much less likely to want to hear the opinions of a charlatan. They're going to want experts, or at least people who are more credible. Look at the people that are those credible sources. They're not huge channels by any means, because it turns out that the sword community is smaller than it appears. We don't have millions of people just eager and hungry for high-level detail. There are maybe millions of people who might be interested in sort of shallow surface-level stuff, but as the level of technical knowledge goes up, the number of people goes down. That's just the way that it is. And also, we forget that there's more entry points for that surface-level knowledge than there ever have been, and there's also more experts. So the outcome of this is that the foundation that Shad had built upon, that foundation is crumbling. It also means that the appetite for long-form YouTube content is just not what it appears either. Sellsword Arts, which is a huge channel, I think is mostly propped up by their shorts content. Their long-form content never got to the kinds of views that the short-form stuff did, because I think it turns out a lot of people are interested in a few flashy casual exchanges and maybe one or two pithy dialogues than they are a long-form discussion about how that fencing was produced. Is that wrong? No. I'd argue the same kind of thing would have happened in 2015 if YouTube had allowed shorts back then too. Shad's just never comparing like for like when he's trying to convince you that he's not actually a victim of anything other than his own ego. I can speak from personal experience that every year our HEMA club gets a huge number of people who want to join, and this happens at the start of the year because they've seen some YouTube video or whatever and they really wanted to do it, they googled us, they found us, and they joined. But then, over time, we bleed a lot of these people out of the club, because the reality of learning how to sword fight is not what you get online. It takes really hard, grueling work for somebody to become proficient with a sword, and a lot of people just bounce off that. That's perfectly fine, but it's also the same for YouTube. Long-form content has to be entertaining to watch, because the investment required is a lot more than a couple of seconds on a short. And if people weren't watching your stuff, it's not because YouTube doesn't want them to. YouTube doesn't make money out of shorts. There's no ads they can put on there. They want people watching long-form content. If they're not able to find people to watch your stuff, it's not for a lack of trying on their part. My final comment is about the passing of time. One thing that the viewing public doesn't really understand is that it is actually difficult to build a career on YouTube. A lot of the biggest names on YouTube, people like Tom Scott and MatPat, well, they recently retired from YouTube. These are people who were still relatively young, especially by working standards, and yet after years on this platform, they decided to call it quits and move on with their lives, mostly to other things. We're talking about some of the most successful creators in this platform's history. People like MatPat have fundamentally changed what it means to be a YouTuber, and yet he just walked away. What would it be like for somebody much less successful and much less famous? What does it look like for somebody who dedicated their working life to YouTube and is facing down the prospect of coming away from it with nothing actually really to show for it? I think the passage of time affects all careers, but whereas an accountant or a lawyer can expect to sustain their career for their entire working life, maybe not at the same firm, but definitely doing the same thing, a YouTuber really cannot. Traditional media, like films, can have actors with lifelong careers, but, a lot of actors never actually have a lifelong career. I think the problem is even worse for YouTubers. Constantly, there's just some new YouTuber that's coming to take your place. Your long-term stability on this platform is really, really not guaranteed. There are people on this platform who've dedicated years, some even decades, to this platform, and yet they're not really going to have anything to show for it at the end of this career, are they? It's not as if they got a retirement plan, and it's not if the work that they received rewarded them disproportionately to what they put in. A lot of people might just be barely scraping by on YouTube, right? And in a lot of other careers, a lot of people do something, maybe for a decade, maybe for 5 years, and then they have to move on, whether willingly or not. So what about Shad then? Well, it's hard to think of Shad as a has-been, especially since he's increasingly decided to just pander to the right wing. If there's one audience of people who have no end to their appetite for nonsense, it's them. So I don't think Shad is going away on YouTube exactly. But what I do think is that we're just seeing the natural endpoint for a career for somebody who refuses to look in the mirror. Shad's LARP armor may be polished to a mirror shine, but it's a shame that he never actually looks in it and reflects. So, thanks everybody for watching this video. What do you think? Is sword content actually sustainable on YouTube, or was it always a mirage? You let me know in the comments. I want to shout out the patrons who make this work possible: Liam Anderson, Dorian, and Discord Dance. For just $1 a month, you can help me justify my time spent making these videos. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, or if you just want to hate watch us. Either is fine by me. Until next time, take care.